When you try to control a modern economy, you first address the obvious needs like labor. What you fail to address is the second and third order needs. For example, you are trying to make clothing, but you run short of oil. Oil? How does oil fit into the manufacturing of, say, blankets? Power looms need lubrication, and fine whale oil was no longer available. Lard was tried, but it proved to be a poor substitute. Tools and machinery proved to be an even bigger problem for the South than food, clothing, or labor. In order to build and run a modern manufacturing system, the South needed financing. The seizure of U.S. mints and property provided scant hard currency. The belief that the South would win developed a good deal of foreign credit. This allowed for the national debt to swell to some $700 million, backed by $27 million in specie. However, after the loss of Vicksburg, the jig was up, and foreigners turned off the credit tap. This caused the runaway inflation, which soared to 6,000%. It was a miracle that the Confederacy lasted much beyond the summer of 1863. How the Confederacy did make it to April 1865 is largely due to our friend Josiah Gorgas. In my rambling style, you have already learned about this phenomenal manager. What sets him apart from practically every other senior man in the Confederacy is his ability to see the big picture, recognize that he cannot do it all himself, use subordinates, and in some cases superiors, to carry out his plans so that Gorgas reached his goal. Let me discuss two of his lieutenants to illustrate just how he did it. When the war began, the South had almost no capability to manufacture gunpowder. There were 4 small powder mills, 2 in Tennessee and 2 in South Carolina. As you'll remember, Gorgas tapped George Washington Raines to create this vital resource. The first steps, as I have already explained, was to greatly enlarge the operations in Nashville. Raines secured the means to produce saltpeter. From the humble beginnings in Nashville, Raines established a number of other powder mills throughout the South. The major facility in Augusta, Georgia, was built from the ground up as a modern production facility. The fact that Raines could conceive of, plan for, build, and have these facilities operational by April 1862 is astonishing. Gorgas found First Lieutenant John W. Mallett on the staff of General Robert Rhodes. Mallett was a chemist, and he was just the man Gorgas needed to head the ordnance labs and oversee the production of ammunition. The first thing Mallett was asked to do was to survey the ammunition. This was not easy for this mild-mannered scholar, but Mallett was an outstanding scientist, leader, and manager. His report stressed standardization of ordnance and the centralization of production. This document became the blueprint Gorgas used successfully manage the arms of the Confederacy. It also gave him the reasons for gaining partial control of the railroads, iron production, and a great number of other Southern enterprises. Although centralization would be compromised out of necessity, Mallett's plan, as executed by Gorgas, was the main reason the South held out so long. The next 2 examples illustrate first how Gorgas could build industries out of thin air, and second, how he could be very flexible when the war took its toll on the industrial engine. Behind the production of Southern-made pistols was yet another one of Gorgas's superstars. This time it was James H. Burton. Burton had spent some time with the British firm that made the Enfield rifle. He was put in charge of building a new armory in Macon, Georgia. One of his pet projects was to design and produce a pistol at the startup firm of Spiller and Burr. Burton based his design for 15,000 pistols on the Whitney revolver, an updated design of Eli Whitney's original pistol. Many of the machines needed to make the firearms came from the captured equipment from Harper's Ferry. By December 1862, the plant in Atlanta shipped its first pistol. Although the troops had issues with this homegrown item, the fact that they could produce it at all was nothing short of a miracle. 1,451 of these pistols were produced, and they are prized by collectors today. Later on, when Sherman threatened the Spiller and Burr plant in Atlanta, the entire production floor was moved to the Macon arsenal. The problems that Gorgas had with shortages as the war was going badly for the South gives you some insight into the man's flexible thinking. Sometime shortly after the Battle of Chattanooga, the Ducktown copper mines fell into the hands of the Yankees. This was a terrible loss, as 90% of the needed copper came from there. Until the mines were lost, copper didn't seem like a very critical item. However, all muzzle-loading artillery pieces used a small copper tube filled with ignition powder and fulminate of mercury to set the gun off. No copper, no artillery. Mallet tried to use a paper friction primer, but this was not very successful. Blockade running brought a little copper in, but nothing like the amounts needed. To make up for this deficiency, the Ordnance Bureau impressed turpentine and apple brandy stills in North Carolina. They got enough copper coils for the last 2 years of the war. The war probably should have ended soon after the retreat from Gettysburg, when it became clear that the North was not going to give up and let the South just be. After that, Grant came east and Sherman marched south, and thus the war continued into 1864. The one big hope was that Lincoln would fail to be reelected that fall. Operating on interior lines, with the logistical support created by Gorgas, the South fights on. Now it is a slow wasting away. Until the fall of Atlanta, only bits and pieces of supply was removed from the system. The story of copper is a good example, but once Atlanta was no longer in Southern hands, large chunks of the production distribution capability were lost. Not only were the factories gone, but the hub and spoke plan of the rail lines was shattered along with the stores, in-rail cars, and warehouses. To make Gorgas's problem worse, when Hood evacuates, he goes not southeast, but west. Georgia's Governor Brown will not release the arms to Hood. Bills were not being paid, so even if ordnance wanted to buy from private armories, they could not. Not even the agriculturally focused South could feed the men under arms and the population in general. Some of this problem was not enough crops, but the bulk of the issues was the lack of transportation. It seemed like Gorgas was playing a game of whack-a-mole. As soon as he got one area under control, another one went critical. His plan of decentralization helped a little, but the war was clearly winding down. The coup de grace was financial. Inflation finally overwhelmed the Confederacy. In some of the plants being run by ordnance and manned by slaves, they could not even buy enough food with the worthless money and the lack of transportation. They tried to send the stores and machinery to a safe location, but the one they picked, Savannah, Georgia, turned out to be a horrible sight. Sherman feasted on the carcass of Gorgas's logistical base. At the end, Gorgas was in Danville trying to make provisions for the expected arrival of the government and the army with General Lee. Neither group made it, so Gorgas heard about Appomattox while still in Danville. The fact that the Confederate States of America lasted almost 2 years longer than it had any right to was, in the main, due to the genius of Josiah Gorgas.